responsible for a lot of the media around the R&D tax offset. They work really closely with the GDAA. And their job is quite largely to help educate us about PR marketing as we move from being a publisher-driven industry into an independent-driven industry. If you at all got excited about the concept of building a brand this morning during Jesse's conversation, and you got sold on how necessary it is and how critical it can be to your business, and you walked out of there wondering, well, how the heck do I go about doing that? And what are some practical skills and practical tools for actually developing and building my brand, whether I'm building my brand as me, as my company, or building the brand as a series of games? That's what Corey's here to help us do today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Corey.
I'm really excited to be here. I'm using a program called Prezi, and I haven't used it before presenting, so if there's glitches, please bear with me. Just as background, as Frank said, I'm the Managing Director of Espresso Communications. We actually look after the video games industry, IGA, so we do a lot of work around classification, education of the market, just in terms of the role that video games do play. And we've been working with IGA for about 4 or 5 years, and it's a vastly different story than what it was when we started. So I'd like to think that there's been a lot of shifts in the way that video games are perceived, particularly in the mainstream, and that's been a really exciting communications challenge. So without further ado, what can PR or great PR do for your business? So I think you've already had some sort of broader conversations. Hopefully today we can dig down a little bit. Support sales. Everyone wants to sell product, and that product sales part of it is an important component. But also attract great skills. And we work with a broad range of clients, and often one of our KPIs, or one of their KPIs, is really being on the radar for great talent. So that talent knows that you're there. So what we find these days is that the staff that you want often interview you, and they often do that by what they read about you before they actually come to meet you. So that's actually quite an important part of some of the communications objectives that we find for many organisations, and I would expect yours are no different. The other is profile for broader business ends. There might be opportunities to form partnerships, you might be looking for investment. There's lots of things to do from a broader business perspective, apart from sell product, that really do shape what your objectives might be from a communications perspective. So again, all of those things, and there's obviously lots of others, but we'll try to keep it simple and looking at those 3 things as being key reasons why PR can be quite successful. I can't fast forward this, I'll try a little bit. The reason I've got it here, I'm just going to go forward to see if I can get it to 4 minutes.
Has done 60 million downloads across our paid, free and ad-supported versions.
I'm going to talk over
it's going over
the key thing from
500,000
this is listening to half
downloads every day.
So that in terms of their success, it was prefaced by 2 things. One was an investment in IP, I'm sure you've talked a lot about that at the conference. The other was building their brand and actually developing relationships with the media. So if you think of the big takeout of a very successful company, 2 things, IP and building their brand as a company. So I just wanted to showcase, because when I read that, I thought it was really great that sort of communications made it so far up from where they sat. That was an important strategic decision to make sure that that was paramount. So key messages, everyone goes, oh, we know what we do. And we've all heard about the elevator pitch and how to actually articulate your company. We work with really large organisations, and I've almost seen grown men and women cry over this. It is hard. So what I'd suggest is you go back and you sit down and you work out, who are we? What do you do? Who do you do it for? And how are you different? And everyone will be different, but if you can answer those questions and if you're comfortable to reel those off, I think it makes a massive difference to be able to underpin all of your communications. Because apart from the things we read in the media, apart from the things that you do in terms of those traditional sort of media relations activities, you're also having conversations with people every day. I think most of you probably would have had, tens and 20s of conversations in the last couple of days. And if you were able to really articulate all of these things really effectively, you'll have cut through a lot of those conversations. It's remarkable about whether you're a large company or a smaller organisation, people find it really difficult. And we spend a lot of time working with organisations going through these four things. And if you can nail them and you feel confident nailing them, it's amazing what it will do in terms of cutting through what your company and organisation actually penetrates in what's a really noisy landscape. So the toolkit, again, more preparation. What does that toolkit look like? Does anyone know what a boilerplate is? There we go. If you have a look at most media releases, right at the bottom of the media release is a boilerplate. It's really basic information about that company. If you're an unknown, I think Microsoft's, for example, is one line because they're Microsoft. People know what they do. You wouldn't want to go more than a couple of hundred words. But if you can articulate exactly who you are, what you do, who you do it for, where you're headquartered, how many staff you have, a very basic amount of information and a link to your website. If you're an unknown organisation or an organisation that's becoming more familiar to those sort of media and influencers, the first thing someone's going to do is look at your communication and go, who are these people? And then they're going to go straight to the bottom and they're going to try and work out who you are. So that boilerplate, it's housekeeping. And it should stay the same. It shouldn't change unless those fundamental kind of vital statistics change. But a boilerplate is one of those things that's just really good to make sure it sits on your communications, because journalists will do it. They get hundreds of emails a day. They're going to go straight to the bottom and go, who are these folk? Are they worth talking to? Executive photography, again, those sorts of housekeeping things, get some great photography. The difference between getting quoted in an article, if you get the full quote and a photo because you've got great photography, we see it all the time. Photography, a lot of the meetings these days are really hungry for colour and movement. Our job is to make sure we have that colour and movement at the ready. It's there. So investments in photography. We work with professional photographers. Think interesting textures. Think of anything creative that you can. Or you might want your headshots and stuff so you've got them. But think of those creative photos. If you're watching an editor sit down and look how they're going to allocate the story, the best photography will win. And it's easy and cheap compared to what the value of that article will be in terms of return on investment. I'm talking very print-based here, but again, online channels are also very hungry for images, and it makes a big difference. Product images and screenshots, having those at the ready, and that goes into the resource gallery. Your resource gallery, if you can have that ready to go, it's filled with all of those things that builds this perfect visual kind of picture of your story, your products, anything that you've got that you can send a link to. Over the years and the time that I've been working in PR, there was a whole frustration with high-resolution images and sending them by email. These days, we can have galleries that you can provide a password to or send a link to. They might be open. I think open is probably better because your whole community can use them. But journalists, if they've got all that stuff to pull together a rich story, they'll use it, and it really helps you stand out from the pack. So a plan. Planning is really important. As we know, everybody's time poor. If you're going to do a public relations program or a communications program, I really recommend sitting down and thinking, what are we going to do? If you're going to allocate time and resources, it's better that it's targeted. So thinking about what that is, like what are your objectives? And these don't have to be massive, lofty objectives. They have to be objectives that really are achievable. If we're going to do something this year, what is it going to be? What does success look like? And it doesn't have to be, we need to be, the best known sort of developer in Australia. It can be like success for us looks like we have a regular dialogue with 3 of our key influencers. That's a good outcome for a medium-term communications program. And consider your strategy. How are you going to do this? How are you going to go about doing this? And then following under that are the tactics, making sure that they're clear and achievable. I think people, there's the age-old thing of people saying, what do you do to work in PR? What is that? It is complicated, it's a bit wafty, it's a bit mercurial. What we tend to do to try and make sure that we stay on track is look at what our objectives are, what's the strategy in terms of how we're going to approach meeting the objectives, and then what are the specific tactics, and putting a calendar together. So if you're a smaller organisation, that calendar might be, I'm going to set aside 2 hours a month, a week, to do these things, execute these tactics. So I think having a plan, even if it's a 1-page, and then reviewing it at the end of the year, it really makes a difference. Because then I think people get frustrated and go, what have we done? What have we done? But if you know that your outcomes are really achievable, it'll help you feel like actually we are on track and we actually have better dialogue, we have better communications than we did say this time last year. About these tactics of which you speak. So what are these tactics? And I know we've talked a little bit earlier about talking about brand, we talk about these high level things about how you promote our businesses through these channels, but what are the tactics? I'm not an expert in German philosophers, but Gestalt. I'm a firm believer that by doing things together, it's the whole principle around, the total is greater than the sum of its parts. But people will talk about PR and do a media release, which will often sink like a stone. So I think if you look at sort of communications, look at it in its entirety. A little bit of everything carries much greater weight than the pieces into themselves. So relationship building. So for media, journalists, I think there's definitely journalists here. I think you'll all know journalists that you probably read regularly. So media are fairly, a straightforward sort of target. This one's standing in the back of the room. He's writing down. Bloggers, and we call bloggers and influencers increasingly important because one, often we'll find that those influencers have international reach, whereas sometimes that's not necessarily the same case with media, not necessarily, I say. So looking really broadly at who those influencers are. They might be Twitter influencers, they might be bloggers, but if you identify that kind of sphere of influence, if you like, it's really important. And what does a relationship building look like? I actually met a journalist that we know on the bus on the way in here from the airport. And he said that someone kept calling him. If you can look at your relationship building activities as what's in it for both people. So if there's a journalist you'd really like to get to know, shoot them an email, introduce yourself. Journalists need this information. They want to know what's going on, but they want it in a way that they don't feel like they're going to be totally pressured and completely swamped. This guy's telling me that he had about 20 phone calls from some guy and he just doesn't get it. Run the 20 phone calls. Send him 20 FYIs over the course of a year. Didn't know I'm not sure if you saw this article. I thought it was quite interesting. It's actually quite similar to what we're doing over here. I'll leave it with you. 2 lines. Just build up that relationship. Obviously the coffee, sitting down having face-to-face. I'm sure all the time that's been spent having face-to-face interactions throughout the conference it's invaluable. You can't trade face-to-face. And if there's an opportunity to do that and sit down and have a coffee or have a beer, absolutely invaluable. Talking about influencers, Espresso, we're influencers in the sense that we have journalists coming to us, given our relationship with the industry, that say, we need a story. Who do you know that's doing this? Now I'm then like, Tony, and Tony obviously is an influencer, but we need to find these stories from time to time because people will ask us. So think about those people that are the touch points for people that are trying to pull this information out of this great community, and let them know what you're doing. If I know what you're doing, we're doing some stuff around serious games at the moment. We're looking at those great stories. It might not be today, it might not be in 3 months, but it might be in 6 or 12 months ago. Oh, I met this great company, they came and introduced themselves and said this is what we're doing, or shot us an email. So think about those people that can help kind of fast track that awareness, because it's in this whole sea of information. We really do appreciate if people know what's needed. When I say we, in this case I'm PR, but journalists think in the same way. They need that information, they need it delivered to them in a way that really helps them sort through that stuff. So if you've got great stories, then, and even if they're not great stories, it's things of interest or things you've noticed, if it's a trend, then that information helps sift through what you're seeing. You're at the coalface, so you're seeing some really exciting stuff. So feel free to share that. And the other relationship building is with fans. We'll talk a little bit about social media, and I'm not sure how many sessions on social media have been here at the conference, but we kind of see that blending very much into that traditional sort of PR landscape. So your fans become influencers. They become people within greater numbers carry a lot of weight in terms of, I guess, supporting sort of what you're doing. The media release. Has anyone written a media release? A couple of people. I think the challenge with media releases, and I've put some pointers here, is that there's an urge to write a media release as a narrative. And often you see media releases that haven't been written professionally, and they'll start by telling a story. So what we want to do is we want to turn that right upside down. You tell the story at the end. So the background to this is more in sort of print publication where the sub-editor would come along and then just chop the bottom of the story off. So the important stuff has to be right up the front, and it has to be succinct, it has to be active language, and you want anything that you can afford to lose down the bottom. Really, I think there's statistics, I've dug them up in the past. Most journalists will read approximately, you might get 7 to 11 seconds. You don't want to have the good stuff buried down the bottom, gone. And so, really important to think about that when you're writing things. I also don't think the media release is the beginning, middle and end of a PR program. The media releases are nice to have. I think it's a good place to aggregate your information. It's a good place to refine your messaging. Are we all comfortable? Get circulated around. Is everyone happy this is what we're saying? That's when all of a sudden you get two people going, oh no, that's not what we're saying. So the media releases are important to help you bring it all together, but it's not, the days aren't the same where your communications will be, they might consist of a whole range of things like tweets and emails and all sorts of stuff rather than the media release. But it is a good place from a discipline perspective to aggregate all of your information. So strip out the lingo and know your audience. You might write a couple of releases depending on what your audience is. If it's a family game, you're really writing for a family audience and think about it in that way. But strip out anything that's going to confuse the reader. Like, we work a lot in technology, like chunky enterprise technology, and the amount of different ways you can sort of abbreviate things, and we just keep going and pulling it all out, as well as kind of the management speak. Everyone knows that. I'm not sure that you guys are going to be victims to this, but there's a lot of management speak that we kind of strip out of things. Keep it plain, keep it simple, could your mum read it and know exactly what you're doing? If you're closer to that end of the spectrum, it's going to get a lot more cut through than trying to sort of complicate the language. I'd say consider SEO. So a lot of the time, I think releases that we write, we'll send out releases we know aren't going to get a good media pickup, but they might get a good search pickup for some of our clients. And that's important because it needs to be local. You need somebody searching to pick that stuff up. So think about SEO, think about some keywords. Just consider SEO when you're putting together those documents. And remember the pyramid. I've talked about the pyramid, and it's PR 101. If anyone's on a communications degree, this is week 1. Most crucial information, you should be able to go back and tick off who, what, when, where, and why. And that's literally tick off. And that could be, you have announced today, have launched today, have released today. Think about what you are doing today. You know, where, obviously you can start with Melbourne, Australia, Sydney, Australia. You know, when, whatever time, whatnot. So just keep it really succinct. And then the call to action, it can be downloaded here, or is available for interview, or is available for photography, or etc. That can go in the middle. That's your key messaging. That's where you might include some of your quotes from people. And then your boilerplate. We talked about that right from the start. And the contact information. Contact information. It sounds so pedestrian, but the number of journals that will say that people don't have contact information. So just think about those sort of like really nuts and boltsy sort of things. We did a social media release for IGEA around the launch of some research that was launched about a month ago. The social media release has been in debate for about 8 years. You'll have someone come out and you launch a social media release, it'll be fabulous, and then it drifts away and people kind of drift back into text. I think there's 2 kind of main themes of doing it. One is around hyperlinking through your story, so you can link through to all of those sort of assets we talked about, the rich colour and movement. The other is actually using a service that we can use, or you can build it effectively. We've used AAP here, and it's just to bring together all the different parts of the story. So in this case, newsrooms could download it, so we had high resolution footage. We had audio, so radio could download it. We had the actual reports, the website, opportunities to share the article. Up here, this is where we had the high resolution, high-res footage, which was broadcast quality. That's expensive, it's not kind of as a pricey out of the park, but that's the sort of thing. There's ways of achieving the same ends by having those bits and pieces. If it's screen grabs and all collated in one place. So this is an extension of the toolkit we talked about earlier. I've got a little piece here of Jeff Brandt.
Digital Australia New Zealand 2012 is the 5th in a series of studies that we've been conducting since 2005. The purpose of DAN's 12 is to highlight the complexities of gaming in Australia and New Zealand.
So, I mean, obviously that's for a very specific market, it's for news. You'll notice he's put together, the way he's speaking there is that the news editor could come in and chop out bits as they needed them. So we didn't get a lot of news pickup on that, but we have had over 1,000 downloads, which means that there's 1,000 people out there that have viewed those videos, they've used them in a certain way. It might be someone presenting, at the university, it might be industry, it might be government, but that content's been made available and it's only been up for a little while. So it may have been run and we might have missed it in monitoring, but it's good to know that we've provided the content and it's been used. So that's just an example of how we try and look at building out all of those assets. It's lots of stuff to use. Executive profiling. Does anyone know what I mean by executive profiling? I mean, it's fairly self-explanatory, but I think the idea, many of us get sort of buried in our day-to-day work of actually going out and speaking about ourselves can be like, daunting. I think there's a lot of other, things to do in the day. But what you find, if you think about sort of the companies in Australia that that have a good brand, they also have a very distinguishable spokesperson. So we'd always recommend having like one person as that touch point. If you've got four partners and you're trying to give everyone a share of voice, you've just watered down your share of voice. So, and I know it's easy to sort of give everyone a go at the limelight, but it's much better to actually have one point person, or at worst you might have a creative point person and a technical point person. But you really do need to think that you're creating a face for the company that is part of building that brand, and it's much easier to do if you've got an identifiable person to hang on to. So think laterally about profiling opportunities, like really laterally. Think about your local paper. I was going through this at work and someone said, yeah, Ida Buttrose was in her local paper the other day, and so we sort of think, oh really, the local paper? It's amazing what they run, it's amazing who reads it. Particularly, I live in Sydney, and the Manly Daily, or the Mazza Jazza, as we like to call it, is very well read. So think about the local papers. Think about Qantas in-flight. Think about in-flight magazine. So when you're reading things, think actually we've got a good story to tell. There are lots and lots and lots of them. Think about community radio. So bylined articles and Q&A things. There's lots and lots of opportunities to place things like the question and answer, particularly around local industry, about insights. It might be about skills. Think about the career section of The Age. They might talk about what it's like sort of developing sort of young sort of creative talent. So if you think really laterally, and if your eyes and your antennas are open as you're reading, I think that provides some good clues about where you could potentially place things. So a bylined article is an article that's contributed to a publication that's been written sort of entirely by the contributing person. They're really welcomed in many spheres because, as we've seen, sort of the media market sort of change, shrink, resources are a bit trickier. Increasingly, we're looking to, they're looking to vote to contribute bylined articles, and you've got lots of great ideas and thoughts that can be teased out and contribute pieces there, include photo. And again, that becomes sort of content that sort of can float around and builds your profile. The same with the Q&A opportunities, there's lots of them. Good social media content, which I just mentioned. As I'm sure everyone knows that's got any sort of social media beast that they're trying to feed, the more content you've got, it makes it much easier, I think, to keep that going, keep building, keep the conversation going. And it's searchable, so if all that's up there on your website, it's searchable. It provides some energy that makes a big difference. I don't know how many of you have been to a website and you've gone to the news section and they might have had like a media release from April 2010. You just got this vision of tumbleweeds tumbling through. And it doesn't matter what's going on behind the walls of the company. If you're not looking at sort of feeding that beast in a regular way and committing to it regularly, it's very noticeable and it's hard to do. But I'd almost say if you're going to commit to it, then do it well. Otherwise, it can almost be a little bit counterproductive. The practical stuff. So again, this is the stuff we talk to for a lot of the larger companies that we work with. Be available. People that are available will absolutely get people coming back to them over and over again for a conversation. If someone knows, actually there's someone on the phone that I need to talk to and can actually park other things for a minute, clear their mind, take the time to think about it, someone who's available to media, I keep saying media influencers, then it makes a big difference. Returning calls, if you say you're going to return a call, really important to do it. All this stuff seems basic, but when someone's on deadline and they're stressed out of their head, they'll always remember you if you come back to them and really help them out with information when they need it. They'll always remember you if you said you were going to call at 3 and didn't. So it's a really good opportunity to leave a great impression. And certainly like in the startup space, across sort of technology generally, you see that there's a cluster of companies that are routinely spoken about, they're routinely profiled. They're routinely profiled because they're trusted, want to come back, and they're trusted because they know they get quality information. Ideally, we'd love to see all you guys being that trusted source for information. And that just comes from that basic old thing of reliability. Highlight credibility. Again, it's sort of counterintuitive for us to sort of talk in that way of like, I'm fabulous, but you've built up a huge amass of experience and insight and credibility. Make sure you highlight that. Again, we talked about those few companies that are well known in Australia because they've established credibility. Part of that's because they've been quoted extensively before, but they're also good at highlighting what they're good at. If you've been a developer for 10 years, that's 10 years. Make sure you highlight that. If you've got insights in a certain area that are quite valuable or special, make sure you highlight that. Journalists are trying to wade through the sea of people that are putting their hand up. They're trying to find credibility. So if you built these credentials and this expert status, highlight it and don't feel shy. It's really important. And I think it'll come much more naturally. And then remember your toolkit. If you've done an interview, you've done everything right, you've been available, you've returned the call, you've highlighted your credibility, then you've got to go, oh, actually, I'll shoot you the link to our photos and some screenshots, because that's the icing on the cake. And you've gone to the trouble of building it, make sure you connect the dots. You might have got off the phone, you're thinking, oh, I said the right things, but use that time, or make someone else perhaps that you work with, to make sure you send up all that follow-up stuff, because that helps build out the story, given you've taken the trouble to build it. Issues management. I'm not sure if anyone here's had any issue or has any journalists sort of looking to chat about things that they're not probably wanting to chat about. Has that ever happened? I'm looking over here. Issues management, I think, can happen. It just can happen overnight. It might be a disgruntled employee. I mean, all of a sudden, a disgruntled employee could go to start taking conversations public. That doesn't necessarily have to be even directly to the media. It could be via social media channels, which, if it gets loud enough, will end up in the media. I can see your type, okay. So I think the key thing with issues management is prepare. And by prepare, I mean to sit down and think, okay, what is our statement here? What's happening? Finding the information, talking to everyone, also getting all your stakeholders on board. And by stakeholders, it's a very wanky term for all the people that have, I guess, an investment in what's going on. So it might be all your partners, it might be your key customers, it might be whoever your stakeholders are, just making sure everyone's on the same page, that that you're comfortable with what you're going forward with. Be consistent, and repeat, just consistency. There's nothing more, I guess, detrimental than going out with different perspectives of what's going on. Resist the temptation to ostrich. I'd say emu, but I don't think emus bury their heads. I think ostriches do. That whole kind of, it'll go away. We talk about a news cycle. News cycles have changed a little bit with online because it's a bit more sort of mercurial. But things pass, they blow over. They blow over more slowly if journalists get frustrated. I keep talking about journalists. But if you can there actually provide a response, provide a perspective, and provide insight, then everyone can kind of go, okay, well, that's the story, it is what it is, and move on. Because things happen, things do happen. But the attention span is only going to be as long as it is, and it warrants. So sometimes you just have to go full on the sword in whatever way, make sure everyone's comfortable with what you're going forward with, put it in writing, so it's documented, everyone's happy. But if you avoid it, it has a way of manifesting. It has a way of kind of going, and suddenly you find other people quoted that might have half the story and thinking, hang on, they don't have the full story. If you have the story that you want to share, then make sure you get on the record and come out right on the front foot and say it. With that being said, don't get bullied into private info. That's private. If it's about a specific employee, remember anything that you would keep private as part of your company organisation. You wouldn't talk specifically about cases, you wouldn't talk about financials if you're a private company. Don't feel like you need to share off the record information if it's not meant for the public sphere. So that comes part of the preparation, just being clear about what are our lines here, what are we prepared to say, in what way that will actually help sort of explain the situation if that's what's necessary. But don't worry, it's really important just to keep those lines firm and not sort of breaching any of the kind of employee staff or any of those other things that might pop up. So again, I actually put this slide in here, and it's got a little, you've got the storybook and DNA. This journalist I ran into on the bus, he just said, I told him what I was doing, he goes, ask everyone to help tell us stories. People want stories, they love stories, and you guys all have stories. You also have products, and you have lots of great things, but to be able to couch it in a story, and that whole notion of a narrative really makes a huge difference in getting that cut through. So we work with a company called IINet, which you've seen before. If you read anything about IINet, chances are it talks about the history of the company. They talk about it being started by Michael Malone in the garage in 1993. That's still in their company boilerplate today. They've held on to that story. That's about local, it's about Aussie grown, it's about smart, smart technology. So that's their story. And despite the fact that they're a massive company now, they're still hanging on to their story. And it helps get cut through, and it helps distinguish them in the market from, say, Telstra, whose story is much different to that kind of, starting in the shed. So think about stories not only just with your products, but also with your company. Any way you can help kind of create that story, and also with case studies of people using or playing the games, any way you can build it out and paint the picture to grab that opportunity, because people really do respond to that notion of a narrative. We talked a lot about visual before as well. The social suite. I dare say there's probably a few people in the room that aren't in sort of, obviously, like Facebook, LinkedIn or Twitter, they all have some different uses for different things, and so I don't want to tell you to suck eggs, but are many of you using these tools just in sort of like everyday kind of communications around the company? Yeah, most of you. So Facebook is an obvious one. I think Facebook can be a bit hit and miss depending on what you're trying to do. I think people really like it personally. I think if you're going to do from sort of more of a marketing channel, I think you need to be sort of very content driven, and maybe it's about building your community that might be friends and family that might grow from there. LinkedIn, again on the more professional side, LinkedIn's really valuable. So if you have met folk today and stuff, I think it's really valuable, that network, that business network, particularly depending on what your objectives are. Part of it is about forming those relationships with potential partners or journalists on LinkedIn. I mean, those tools are, I think, really valuable to use. And again, Twitter. How many of you are on Twitter? Most people are on Twitter. How many people use Twitter for work in terms of coming through Twitter? Okay, so I think Twitter's a good one, particularly if you've got, again, great content through Twitter, can move very quickly. But all of these tools, with the exception maybe of LinkedIn, are very content dependent. So the idea that you can engage your community and those people who like your brand, they like your work, if you can really effectively get them to do the heavy lifting for you, I think it makes a huge difference if you're trying to get cut through. It gives you credibility because people go, oh wow, they've got all these fans. It gives you, if you want them to do something, i.e. send them downloads or get some activity around a certain release, if you've got those people doing the heavy lifting and you sort of crowdsourced, if you like, some energy around something, it makes a big difference to credibility and for people to take notice. So use those groups and think about how you're going to use that kind of social media kind of energy as you go. I just put this up here because I thought it was funny. So, I think we've got our questions. So it's very high level, but I hope it gave some tactics. Have anyone got any questions about what we talked about?
So I think the whole idea is that we want to make it as easy as possible for journalists to write about and share our stories. Can you give us an example of a media kit that makes it really easy for them to do that work so that they don't have to chase us up for anything?
Yeah, I'd say, well, in there you want a bio, so background on the executive, like who are you, what have you done, thinking, remembering credibility. You want the executive photography in there. You might want a company backgrounder, really basic, one page, establish when, employs this many people, headquarters here, sort of a bit of an expanded version of your boilerplate, and screenshots. You might be links to sort of bits of sort of content that you have, games that you have, something that can provide that rich experience. So it might be sort of embedded and using the photography. So anything sort of multimedia that's relevant to share, absolutely. And then things about you to help put in context. And the bio, they might put up a couple of lines, but it helps just to have that information in one spot. Yeah.
How do you think, especially with a small startup where you don't have much manpower, a lot of this PR stuff is like a full-time job and you just can't afford when you've got a full team of developers. How would you go about, trying to break it down or break down responsibility of PR stuff, or just have one person dedicated to PR? What would you suggest?
I'd probably find the person there, maybe it's like a 0.2 of their job, find the person that loves it. There's always going to be a person that's kind of will gravitate towards that stuff. Find that person. I've certainly found that in our own company with the social media stuff. You find the people that love it and then you kind of go, right, dedicate this percentage. Then I'd go back to your planning, because really sitting down and go, all right, what's realistic that this person can take away from their normal duties? And it might be 3 media releases a year, a coffee catch up a quarter. Just keep it really achievable. And like I say, it is difficult, and I realise it's always a resourcing issue. And but if you can kind of tick those things off with the person in your organisation, it's most likely to love it, or to go out to an event and say, oh, I met so-and-so, great, can you make sure you snap a coffee with them? I'd love to chat with them. Try to move with the natural tide, and move with the movement you can.
When it comes to self-promotion, especially when it's linked into your business, any kind of points of view or tips on how to kind of make a good impression and promote yourself without going to the point of becoming obnoxious in kind of the way that you put yourself out there, or it just, just making it to the point where it actually becomes annoying for people?
Look, I think there's a lot of value in asking someone, like if there's a particular person you're looking to engage with, I reckon there's good value in actually saying, if I sent you an email, once a month, is that useful to you? They'll tell you. They'll say no. So first of all, ask people what they like. A lot of people say, yeah, just shoot an email, I'll get to it eventually, or oh, I love a call. I mean, we work with different people. Some journalists say, don't send me an email, call me. I want to be able to talk it out and get rid of my inbox. So first of all, there's specific people that you're trying to engage with. Feel free to ask them, is this useful to you? Because it's got to work for everyone. And if you can find that sweet spot where it's working for everyone, that's what is like the good relationship building. Second of all, if there's another person you work with that can help facilitate that, because I know what you mean. Hi, I'm fabulous. You should, it's a bit hard to do it directly. If there is someone you can bring in, even if you've written it all yourself, but it's coming around that third party. I mean, that's why people engage PR agencies, is we get to tell everyone how fabulous our clients are, and so I understand that degree of separation is a little bit helpful, but also feel free to ask people what's useful to you, and if you've taken the time to ask, I can guarantee they'll remember, because there's a lot of people kind of promoting stuff. If you can kind of go, how can I help you do your job? Just the whole tone and approach is really appreciated, I think.
We've got time for quite a few more, so any of you have anything top of mind, or you're wondering how to do something?
If you have created like a blog schedule updated, how regularly would you say is
How regularly to update a blog?
Yeah, like every few weeks or for like a few months or...
I think ideally probably at least once a week, maybe. The other thing is you're probably better off making sure that you've got content to put in it. So I think that goes back to your planning, like who's going to feed this beast if we set up a blog. We had a go at a blog 5 years ago, and it was a disaster because it was kind of, we should have a blog, and then we just set it up and like, and then it took us the second go to actually go, right, how are we going to feed this? And one thing is, there's no way I could do it on my own, so everyone contributes to it, and we believe that provides different perspectives, it helps kind of feed it. So I guess part of the planning is what's realistic and what we can do here. If you yourself can only do once a month, then are there other people to keep more movement on it? Because I think probably a bit more regularity. Another thing that I should have said about blogging is I think it's really important to go and find those folk that you want to be engaging with and commenting, doing all those comments, leaving comments, engagement. The build it and they will come. There's so many blogs out there. Build it and they will come if you've gone, and they'll come back. But that's spending the energy of the writing, but also the writing and the engaging, because it's the engaging that gets that richness of discussion, which is kind of the beauty of the blog. So go back to your planning, see if you can share the load. And it's a tricky one. Resource-hungry things are tricky. So.
How would one go about finding all the different people to network and communicate with in terms of media links?
Finding them? I guess that goes back to your planning in terms of who your audience is. So if you've got specific releases and you think, right, this audience, it might be, communications plan. You've got your plan, your communications objectives overarchingly. So you might have your company objectives, which means the people you want to talk to might be BRW. You want to talk business. It might be the tech section of the Fin, which is much more kind of game-centric these days. But if it's about sort of reaching sort of young kids and families, then your target's going to be completely different. So it might be some of the sort of major publishing houses that have a lot of the sort of younger titles. And so go back, and it might be if you're looking online, it's like literally searching online. If it's print, you walk through a newsagent and get right back down there and think, where would I like to be? Wow, I'd love to be profiled there. Literally flicking through. The other thing is, if you're doing any sort of executive profile, you actually ring someone and say, I've noticed you do this section. I think we've got something really interesting for this section. If you can actually point out a section or see how your story fits with the format that they go to market with, already you're ahead of the game. Like repeats that journalists all the time will say, we get people spamming us with media releases. So if you've gone to the trouble of going, this is a really good section for us, calling someone up and sending them an email thinking, I've got some really good content that I think would be really valuable for your readers, putting it in their terms because they're trying to write to their readers, you're already way ahead of just sort of doing the scattergun approach of just shooting things out there and overloading. It'll end up in the bin. But does that help? Yeah.
You just have to try really hard to find those individuals.
Yeah, and look, I think again with an agency, the luxury of an agency, they will do that for you. But if you're doing it yourself, then maybe you get everyone engaged to go, right, we need to build up a media list or
But doing it yourself is otherwise pretty much just making it.
it's one of those huge discussions, I don't know. Depends. You might be, if you're smaller, you might be better off sort of marrying yourself with a freelancer who does that. So I think it's all about your size. Like you'll find we don't work with massive tier 1 multinationals, we work with tier 2 multinationals because the tier 1s go with the tier 1s. So find your spot with that person that might be looking to really spot something in you that to grow with you. So I can't tell you how much they cost, but it is an investment. And the other thing I'd suggest is look at what it costs internally from a resourcing perspective. Like it's 0.5 of headcount for a year. That might be a good way, and you don't have to kind of house them, so to speak, and make sure they've got a desk and a computer. So I try and put it, how much would it cost you to do internally, and then you've got access to all of the contacts and information that person has. Sorry.
You're right. So we're in a bit of a unique position where we're actually launching something and we've got this opportunity to actually go to the major media.
Yeah.
So is there any key differences when approaching film and TV media rather than
TV?
Yeah, TV.
Think in terms of pictures and think in terms of the time they've got. So you're talking like broadcast news and what have you?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I definitely think keep it really simple. Think about pictures. Unfortunately, it's getting increasingly controversial. I don't know if you saw that. You probably didn't in Melbourne, but there's a piece, actually not even on Today Tonight, but in Channel 7 News that caused a bit of a furore in Sydney a few weeks ago. But that controversy element, it's just so tabloid, unfortunately, but also kind of thinking, all right, what's the downside of the tabloid and making sure you've got that covered off. So think in pictures, because when you're pitching to them, they're going to be thinking, right, what's there to see? Because, you know, like we just talked about, like the report, we had to have overlay footage of kids playing, and because they can't just interview someone. They might on the 7:30 report, but they wouldn't on Channel 7. The other thing that's really useful to do is actually watch the news and record the sound grabs. And then if you, like, how long did that spokesperson speak for? Usually it's about 5 seconds. So it completely changes the way you think about presenting your information. Because then if you're going back to the narrative of, oh, we started this business in XXXX, then they're working for the exact opposite. You know, I showed the kind of, sort of the...
They were 5 seconds.
5 seconds, that's really hard. It's completely different to what you might have in a long form, like maybe a Kotaku article, which is quite long form, there's some opportunity to get in there, whereas news, they're literally, and paint with pictures, that's the only time.
In terms of actual product releases, I heard that when you only have so many opportunities to bring something to journalists because it's a story point in the next kind of business, and so that you kind of want to make sure that you time things right.
Yeah.
How do you go about figuring out that timing?
Well, first of all, we'd hope that you've got your relationship building, so when they get something from you, it's in context. Secondly, there's different deadlines. So deadlines are important. People are going to have different deadlines. It's worth actually just finding out what they are. Like we've got a major release later in the month. Just want to be clear of what your deadlines are because we'd really love for it to be included. So ask the question. The other is think about the long lead print titles. Might be an opportunity to put something exclusively with them under embargo because then they've got to look at it before something comes down. Before you release it, which will go online. So online's really changed that kind of print versus online argument that print can often be playing a little bit of catch up. They're working on probably January, February now. So if you know you're launching in January, February, but it's at a stage where there's something you can share with them and they get a look in, it's also a relationship builder because they feel like you haven't sort of forgotten that they have print logistics to deal with, so it's a different paradigm. So ask the question about deadlines. And if you can do something, as long as you're very clear about the fact that it is under embargo, and that you're clear about the terms, because you don't want them running on their online site because you're not ready to launch and suddenly it's online.
Yeah.
But it might be screenshots or something, and anticipated it's coming. So.
There's a lot of services now that let you post once and it pushes it out onto all your social streams. Do you think that's a good approach to take, or do you think it's best to individualise the streams that you have?
Are you talking social, or are you talking
social, yeah.
Just social? Oh, look, I personally think that social is an engagement tool. I think you should be engaging with people. I do think that they're hungry beasts, and I think a blend of the two is probably the right thing, as long as you're not over-saturating, because what you don't want is the unfollows and the dislikes. And I'd always look at, am I providing value? Is the whole, I think that overt marketing through those channels, I think it wears off. I think is something that people want to read, and a blend of both. But also, if you've got someone that can, again, dedicate point to a person to engaging on Twitter and starting a conversation, particularly with like journalists or influencers, that makes a huge difference. If you can say, oh, by the way, we've got a release coming up in a direct message, you've already cut through. Oh, okay, let us know what it is, our deadline's here. Oh, actually, this is happening. You've got a dialogue. You can't get that dialogue if you're blasting out. But I think a certain amount of regularity through those sort of channels makes sense. As long as you're looking at all of these tweets going, are we providing value, or are people going to have cause to go, actually, I just think about my stream, you're driving me nuts. So.
I actually had a follow-up question from excellent question earlier. There's a lot of developers right now who are going, like, they realize that they need to do PR, they realize that they need to build their brand, but the immensity of everything that they need to do around that is very scary. We've never done that before. And a lot of people are considering approaching PR companies and outsourcing them.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the pros and the cons of outsourcing your PR?
Well, look, I think there's lots of pros, because obviously you get access to the lists. You get someone, particularly if they're working in a space that's relevant. Sorry. They're across lots of different discussions, and they'll spot opportunities that you're not there necessarily, because you've got your eye on the ball where it should be to spot opportunities for you. So the pro is that you've got people with those proven skills, i.e. the media release writing, all of that sort of stuff will just happen. They do cost money, again we talked about. The cons, I don't know. I think people there, you hear people that have bad experiences with PR, and I think typically that would come back to not being clear about what success looks like and setting expectations. We talked a bit before about, PR being a bit kind of mercurial in terms of what it does. That's why I really need to tie it down to specifics. And the specifics don't necessarily need to be coverage outcomes, because maybe that's just not realistic. Maybe in that first year, it's really about kind of seeding your company, getting people used to talking to journalists, getting your toolkits and all of your background stuff put together. So being practical about what success looks like, if you can get those things cleared up from the outset, if the clear expectations aren't sorted down, that's when you tend to get problems with people going, but they didn't do anything. And we paid this money, and money's tight. Again, resources. You think, we could have done this ourselves. That's something you hear people say as well. So being clear about what you can do internally from a heavy lifting perspective, I don't know why I said that, but in terms of preparation and backgrounding, that you're not paying someone to do that other stuff, but looking at the blend of clear expectations, where are their actual expertise that are going to help you at the pointy end, and what can you do to stop them from doing the bulk of the work that's probably going to cost more. And also aligning yourself with someone you trust. Trust is, again, trust, but it's trust. You really need to trust someone. And I think about going out as an agency, about someone representing us, I'd feel really uncomfortable with it. So I think that if you're going as an agency, finding someone you do trust to actually represent your brand is really important. And it comes down to culture and fit and all those kind of nice coffee things, but they are really important.
I'm currently trying to find a SEO agency. I find it really hard in Australia to find someone, I'm an app developer, I find it really hard to find someone who just does that. A lot of PR agencies would say, look, this product will take long, but I've already had someone do that and not get the results that I need. Is there, and what is the risk of going with someone who hasn't done this kind of thing before? Is it just another product for them to get out there? Or should I be looking for someone who's specifically geared to
I don't know if you're going to find someone that just does apps, because apps can be quite hard because there's lots of them, and to think laterally. So you are probably better off going with a little bit more of a generalist, because I don't think you'll find a specialist just from their own business perspective. It would be hard to kind of maintain.
I can give someone with sort of that kind of digital distribution and maybe social media and that. There's a couple of really good companies in America, but there's just nothing about that
Here, because I guess it's scale, isn't it? I think I would be probably comfortable going with more generalist if it was, depends, obviously consumer, but because they're going to be spotting those kind of left of centre. Because if you look at who profiles apps these days, it's everywhere. Like it'll be in your in-flight magazine, it's in your kids' zone stuff. So you want those people that are talking to those sections all the time. And the apps now, media's had to adjust to be able to actually start profiling those. The Sydney Morning Herald Good Weekend the other day did a big roundup. So media is adjusting, so I think agencies will adjust as well and spot those opportunities. So I think, I don't know if that helps. But it's thinking laterally about where that would go and how you would highlight.
Yeah, I'm just kind of talking about if I should go to an agency, if I should hire Because, of course, the cost against it is probably about $10,000 difference if you can have someone full-time in-house.
Yeah. An individual decision, the only thing with in-house is it depends how broad you go. If you're going really broad, then sometimes it pays to have someone who's got clients in all those different areas. So they're sort of seeing, you know, their vision is a bit broader than having someone in-house, depending on what other things they've got to do to be able to be across like that new insert that came out in West Australia. You know, it's hard to be across that stuff. But that's, you know, it's an individual call. It's just, yeah.
Got time for one more question.
One more question.
Go. So everyone, if you'd like to thank Ford